Hello and welcome to our listeners to the latest episode of Sibylline's Insight podcast. My name is Azul Hidalgo Solá, and I'm the North America Associate Analyst here at Sibylline. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the most recent developments between the U.S. and Venezuela and the implications of the U.S.'s shifting policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean more broadly. Since September 2nd, the U.S. has carried out strikes on vessels suspected of carrying illicit drugs in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific Ocean. And to date, the U.S. has conducted 21 strikes that have resulted in 83 fatalities in the region. This is all part of what U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth has named as part of Operation Southern Spear to combat narco-terrorism in the region. And this notable shift in U.S. policy began in February of this year with the Trump administration's flurry of foreign terrorist organization and specially designated global terrorist network designations, one of which included Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro as being named the head of the Cartel de los Soles, followed by the rolling back of U.S. aid commitments and ultimately a back and forth with tariff threats. This shift in dynamics has resulted in elevated tensions with regional partners such as Colombia and Mexico, just to name a few. And so to help me break this down and assess the implications of all this, I'm joined by my colleagues from the Sibylline's Americas desk, Principal North America Analyst Claire Brady, and Latin American and the Caribbean Intelligence Analyst Alexander Marciniak. So Claire, if we could start with you from the U.S. perspective, how would you characterize this shift in U.S. doctrine in the region, and what are the U.S.'s aims and tactics that it's employing in its dealings with regional governments?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy to look a little deeper into what Trump's policy has been so far and how it continues to shift. I think first it's important to take a look back at what we are used to seeing under the former Biden administration. During those years, the U.S.'s regional agenda was quite limited, and it involved a continuation of sanctions on the Venezuelan regime and the overall promotion of democracy, human rights, and public health programs. And it was quite limited to that. What we have now is the Trump administration, who so far this year has dismantled the U.S. Agency for International Development, a lot of which focused on Latin America. And he's also utilized tariffs and military strikes in the region. So this is really demonstrating a shift from soft power tools into hard power tools. And this is because Trump's policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean falls under the wider umbrella of his global aim to put the U.S. back on a fair footing with the rest of the world. Trump believes that the U.S. has been giving a lot more than it's been receiving. And since he took office, he's been aiming to address that. Specifically for Latin America, this means no longer letting drugs and unauthorized migrants flow northwards into the U.S. It also means establishing better trading terms and also favoring certain leaders over others. Now, importantly, what we've seen so far is that all these aims can be intertwined. For example, when we look at Mexico, Trump wants them to tackle drug trafficking, but also wants to establish a better trading relationship with them. So because of that, the Trump administration is willing to deploy both military and economic tactics, not only to diminish the capabilities of organized crime groups, but also to entice government officials to increase their own security measures and come to the table when it comes to trade. So policy action emanating from the U.S. is likely to be determined by Trump's perception of the strength of a given nation's leadership and the ability of that nation to offer the U.S. economic or military concessions. So in this, multiple political aims from Trump means that he can use multiple tools at once. So we could look at tariffs, sanctions, security cooperation, loans in the case of Argentina, and of course, military action like we've seen with Venezuela. So my point in saying all this is to really emphasize that it's not a one-size-fits-all doctrine when it comes to Latin America and the Caribbean. each nation in the region is being handled slightly differently based on what they have to offer and what Trump believes, they are to blame for, essentially. And this is why we're seeing different reactions across the continent, which we'll get into a bit later. But that is sort of the framework we're seeing emerge from the Trump administration as of now.
Amazing. Thanks, Claire. This is a great baseline to understand the Trump administration's approach and aims toward the region in the coming months. And so in there, you mentioned some measures that I would like to expand upon a little bit. So maybe Alex, considering some of these things that Claire just outlined, what do we see as the impacts of these measures in the region, and how are regional governments reacting to these recent developments in the U.S.?
Yeah, great question. So I'll approach this answer from sort of two perspectives. Firstly, I'll look at some of the impacts on the region, and then sort of transition into, well, what are we seeing Latin American and Caribbean governments doing in response? So I think the principal impacts that we need to look at from the beginning of the Trump administration has been these drawdowns in US aid and foreign funding. I think we're going to look particularly at Colombia. Colombia is the greatest recipient of US foreign aid in the Western Hemisphere. US foreign aid contributes to a whole host of programs ranging from environmental programs looking at Amazon conservation to security cooperation with the security forces. The Colombian security forces have received plenty of training from the US, intelligence sharing as well. Also, they have military and sort of material cooperation agreements as well. And then also looking at more humanitarian projects. So the current peace process in Colombia with regards to guerrilla groups, a lot of that comes from grassroots programs funded by the US. So we're seeing implications there for particularly the humanitarian sector, but also environmental projects as well. Equally, on countries that are reliant on aid, particularly poorer Central American countries as well, receiving feeling particularly impacted by these drawdowns in aid. It's not all bad news. We have seen the US is still doing some funding. It's doing waivers for Haiti, for instance, continuing to do waivers for Colombia, despite removing Colombia as a partner in combating organized crime. We're seeing aid flow from the US to Jamaica following Hurricane Melissa a few weeks ago. The US even offered Cuba aid, although it was rejected. So we're still seeing the US use its aid and its money within the region. So it's not a complete withdrawal. The other impact that we have seen in the region is, as you mentioned, tariffs and economic measures. Although now been repealed as of, I think, this morning, the US tariffs on Brazil's coffee, orange juice, and beef sectors were particularly impactful, both for local farmers and growers in Brazil, but also for the relevant sectors in the US as well. It goes both ways. But on the other hand, as well as sort of punitive measures, we have seen the opposite, sort of coaxing measures. So as you mentioned, in Argentina, there were midterm elections earlier in October. The US provided significant economic aid, or promised significant economic aid, to the current president, President Javier Milei. He won a decisive victory in the midterm election. So I see from his point of view, the US sort of hemispheric turn looking towards Latin America and the Caribbean was positive from his eyes. So we are seeing sort of a range of impacts, one from the sort of impacting local humanitarian projects, but also to aiding certain leaders that the Trump administration views as friendly and as an ally within the region. And what are governments doing in return? Well, a lot of this is trying to prove to the Trump administration and to the US that they are doing their part on these particular issues that so concern the Trump administration. Most notably, I would say, is migration from the Latin America region. We've seen a whole host of countries across the region, looking at Belize, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, to name but a few, that have increased their efforts to facilitate deportations from the US, as well as even some countries accepting sort of third country migrants as well, deported from the US. But this in turn likely can have impacts on the Latin American government. As I said before, particularly in poorer Central American countries, this will likely strain infrastructure, particularly public services and the health sector as well, which already faces financial difficulties. We're also likely going to see movement on the more security side. So, as you mentioned, the US administration has designated several cartels and organized crime groups as foreign terrorist organizations. We've seen this mirrored by Latin American governments looking to signal to the Trump administration that, look, we're on side, we're doing the same as you. So Argentina, Peru, and Trinidad and Tobago have all designated the sort of Venezuelan-based Tren de Aragua organized crime group as terrorists. Paraguay also designated the PCC and CV, the two largest Brazilian organized crime groups, as a terrorist organization. What does this mean in practice for sort of people and businesses? Well, obviously for compliance risks. So if an organization is designated as a terrorist organization, that can lead to all sorts of sort of material support prosecutions and sort of terrorism financing related prosecutions. So compliance risks for businesses, particularly those victims of extortion in the region, will likely feel increasing scrutiny in the sort of coming months and the coming year in Latin America. And I think one of the sort of last things to look at as well is security forces operations within Latin America itself. We've mentioned sort of Mexico. Mexico has significantly increased crackdowns on fentanyl trafficking, fentanyl production, and other synthetic drug production capabilities, particularly in northern regions in Mexico, like Sonora, like in Sinaloa. We've seen increased crackdowns along the border as well. We've seen significant decreases in encounters between CBP, so the US Border Patrol, and migrants along its border. This is largely because Mexico is increasing efforts to disperse migrant caravans and move migrants across its territory so they don't eventually reach the US border. We've also seen countries across the region increasing cooperation militarily. So recently in El Salvador, we've seen US Air Force planes taking off from El Salvadorian airports, looking at increasing collaboration there, as well as increasing use of joint military exercises in the region. So Panama and Trinidad and Tobago have recently done joint military exercises with the US. So we're seeing this increase in cooperation, but what is this going to look like sort of down the line? Well, we assess that sort of Mexico is going to increase its intelligence sharing training with the US to further signal that it's on side with combating cartels and organized crime groups. And then sort of looking finally in more longer term as well, more political sphere. As you mentioned, all these things are intertwined for the Trump administration. And I think that comes from the political dynamic as well. So obviously Milei got his aid from the US. Other countries in the region that have elections coming up, looking at Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica, will likely make more efforts, particularly among conservative and right-wing candidates, to play to Trump and look for increasing aid and increasing support with their eye on, election outcomes.
Yeah, I think also I just wanted to add onto your point, Alex. You mentioned earlier, the tariff exemptions that were recently given to some Latin American nations. And I think you bring up a great point that this isn't all just happening in a silo. It's not that the U.S. does something and the only impacts are within Latin America. Because of tariffs, food prices in the U.S. were rising pretty quickly, and that created or has been adding to huge affordability concerns within the U.S. And it directly impacted Trump's approval rating. And that's a big reason why he repealed some of these recent tariffs, because a lot of Latin American nations export foodstuffs, which of course, really impacts U.S. consumers more than, say, tariffs on steel, aluminum, technology, things like that. And another thing that's happening within the U.S. is that there's a lot of concern over the legality over these strikes in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. And that's not only creating a lot of contention within Congress, but it's also causing some disruptions between the U.S. and its international allies. So, for example, the U.K. has stopped some intelligence sharing with the U.S. because it does not want to be implicated in these strikes. I say all this to emphasize that again, this isn't all happening in a silo. And what the U.S. does in Latin America also comes back to impact its own economy and its own relations, with governments in the region, but also outside of the region as well. And one last point I'll say kind of on the more global impacts is that because Trump repealed these tariffs to a lot of Latin American nations before actually coming to a full trade deal, we could see that some, European nations, for example, get a little upset, like, okay, why did you just repeal all these tariffs, but you wouldn't for us? So yeah, there's a lot at play here. And just to say that, like I said, all these aims are intertwined. Similarly, regional dynamics, all over the world are intertwined. This doesn't only impact, one small part of the world.
Thank you both. I think that kind of illuminates a little bit how the U.S. is shifting kind of its policies, its foreign policies overall across the world. And so kind of to that end and looking more longer term, I think it might be interesting for our listeners to highlight a couple flashpoints that we see coming up in the next couple of months. So, what we see as prospects for an escalation in U.S.-Venezuela relations, maybe a military action from the U.S. in Mexico and Colombia, or impacts in the USMCA that we know is being renewed and negotiated early next year. So maybe, Alex, I can hand it off to you first, and then Claire can jump along.
Yeah, I think the Venezuela issue is certainly one front and center for a lot of our listeners and sort of making the headlines daily. We continue to assess that a strike by the US on Venezuelan soil is a realistic possibility in the coming weeks and months. What will this strike look like? Well, likely a strike on a suspected drug trafficking position, a cocaine lab, an illegal mining outpost, a clandestine airstrip perhaps. This will likely take place in an incredibly rural area, likely along the Colombia-Venezuela border, or in a sort of significant organized crime hotspots like Aragua State, for instance. What will we see after this? Well, we assess that a likely rapid de-escalation in tensions between the US and Venezuela. There's a remote chance that it does any sort of military retaliation against the US. It's not really got the capabilities for that. It's more likely that it will retaliate by repressing the opposition within Venezuela than it is going against the US. Maduro, the president in Venezuela, has already offered almost all concessions that he possibly can to the US. So to that end, we'll likely see some sort of deal between the US and the Venezuelan regime following such strikes. In terms of Mexico and Colombia, we see it as a remote possibility that there is a unilateral US strike on Mexican or Colombian soil. Both are really important military partners for NATO and for the US in the region. So jeopardizing that relationship by conducting military action runs counter to both the US's interest, but also sort of anti-drug trafficking efforts more broadly. What we will likely see, as I sort of alluded to earlier in this podcast, is an increasing cooperation and the use of these threats, both economic, political, but also military, to extract these concessions from Mexico and Colombia. So the threats of tariff, the threats of military action, the threats of supporting different political candidates and affording them some sort of political capital will likely be used as tools by the Trump administration to extract security and migration-related concessions. So what could this look like in practice? As I mentioned, increasing intelligence sharing, increasing cooperation with the security forces. If there's a significant deterioration in sort of security environments in Mexico, particularly if there is impact regarding US citizens or spillover to US territory, then the US sending some sort of ultimatum to Mexico where the Mexican authorities use US military equipment to conduct some sort of strike becomes more likely in that scenario.
Yeah, and I can just add on to that another kind of facet of the relationship with Mexico away from migration and security operations is, of course, also its trading relationship with the U.S. And the upcoming United States-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement negotiations in 2026. We've already kind of had some rumblings from all three governments, saying that they're starting to review their terms and, figure out what their non-negotiables will be and what they will seek to extract from the other two sides. But this is going to be a really big deal in the coming year. And we know that Trump is willing to use tariffs and sanctions to extract what he wants from both Canada and Mexico. Now, as Alex has mentioned, so far, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has been pretty tactful in navigating her relationship with Trump, and she has, really appeased him in a lot of ways and been able to, avoid the most punitive measures that, say, Canada has not been able to avoid as well. But it could be that when all three of these nations are at the table together, things get a little trickier, of course. And because of that, that will open up Mexico to new risks and exposures to tariffs and even sanctions if, Sheinbaum is unwilling to give Trump something that he wants, or even if Canada is holding up the negotiating process, that could come back to hurt Mexico. There's also a risk that the U.S. U.S. decides it does not even want to renew the USMCA and instead pursue two separate bilateral trade deals, which, is not in the best interest of Mexico and Canada at this moment. So again, that could also cause some friction in the U.S.-Mexico relationship going forward. And that will be something that we are watching very closely next year. And of course, will have big implications for the private sector because of how intertwined supply chains are across Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And of course, Mexico is the U.S.'s number one trading partner and a huge ally in alleviating the U.S.'s reliance on China. So again, that is a very important flashpoint coming forward in the very near future.
Thank you so much, Claire and Alex, for joining me today to dive deeper into what is a pretty complex and evolving dynamic that we're seeing in our region. So I really appreciate your support, and I'm sure our listeners will really appreciate your insights. To our listeners, I'd like to direct you to our WRR reporting subscription, where you can keep up to date with all of the hard work that the analysts in the Americas desk are doing. Some of these products include detailed scenarios and situation update briefs on the U.S.-Venezuela developments, as well as a weekly U.S. policy review where we capture all the latest developments stemming from the Trump administration. And so to access a free trial to our WRR subscription, please contact info@sibylline.co.uk. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing you all on the next episode of the Sibylline Insight podcast. Thank you.